A few days ago, there was news that Bloodborne was getting a remaster of sorts. And so I thought now is a good time to offer up a little bit of knowledge for people who may be new to Bloodborne. This isn't some grand thing of what build should you use or what stat should you focus on. This is instead focused on one singular question. What starting weapon should you choose? Bloodborne is a bit different than the other Soulsborne games in that your starting class doesn't determine your weapon, and there's also a quality over quantity approach to weapons. So each weapon in Bloodborne is far more unique, and they more so have their own doctrines, their own playstyles, and depending on which weapon you choose to start out with, it will, in a way, shape your playstyle. It'll shape what skills you gain, and in a certain sense, it can shape how skilled you are as a player. So, I thought to ask, what are the pros and cons of all three starting weapons, and which one should you choose? So we're going to be looking at all three of them and going through, again, just see what you should choose. Here they are. Your options are between the Saw Cleaver, the Hunter Axe, and the Threaded Cane. I'm going to be starting this out by looking at the Saw Cleaver, because it's the first in the inventory. There are also two starting guns. I'm not going to be focusing on those today, so we can just head straight into the Saw Cleaver. And something you'll notice pretty much immediately is this thing is fast. It is very speedy, but it still has a decent bit of damage. So those are two pretty core aspects of a weapon: speed and damage. And the Saw Cleaver has both pretty down. As you can see going through, these are the standard enemies of the first area, and the Saw Cleaver 2 to 3 shots them, which is pretty good. And Bloodborne is a much faster game than the previous titles of Dark Souls 1 and 2, so that speed is extra appreciated. Though, as you can see, it has short range, so you may find yourself on the back foot when dealing with groups of enemies, but every weapon has a transformed or alternate form, which, as you can see here, this one basically doubles the length and brings it over to vertical swings instead of horizontal swings. So it gives you more range, but less crowd control in that aspect. And it's slightly slower, so that may come with some difficulties, but the lack of crowd control is more the issue. Though, as you may have seen there, rolling attacks and dashing attacks, which is the dodge when you're locked on, those do a side sweep. And so that mixed with the extra range is good for dealing with groups of enemies, especially when you're dodging into attacks. And going with the normal form, it's very speedy, which allows you to deal with a lot of enemies like dogs that are very commonly seen as annoying because of how fast and agile they are. Though, despite all of the positives of this weapon, it isn't perfect. There are a few issues Nothing major, but for example, the damage isn't the greatest. That can be offset with upgrade materials like bloodstone shards, but a bigger issue is that it's not great at dealing with large enemies like this. If you know the timings, you can get in some charge attacks that do decent damage and can stun for a small amount of time. And if you go into the alternate form, that doubles the range, meaning it's even easier to do that. But you may have noticed it does a bit less damage. Though, the real problem with Saw Cleaver isn't something that you can really notice when looking at it by itself. You kinda need to look at the other weapons as well in order to fully grasp what's wrong with the Saw Cleaver, or where it's not quite as good. Its main flaw, so to speak. And that's really just something you might hear about the great swords in the Dark Souls series, of that it's the jack of all trades, master of none. So, it's pretty speedy, but it's not the speediest. It's pretty strong, but not the strongest. And then here, the gun, we can take a quick look at this. See, the gun, as you can probably tell by it taking up a full half of your arms, is pretty important. In this game, it's not really about damage, but is instead about getting parries off. And please ignore my bad gameplay, I was rusty at the time. But for a parry, you need to shoot the enemy while they're halfway through an attack, or partially through an attack. And this will create a very noticeable sound. You can hear it there. And it'll put the enemy into a stance where you can then get a critical attack called a visceral. And these viscerals are the main way that you're supposed to take out big enemies, at least when using smaller weapons like the Saw Cleaver. And they scale off the skill stat, but the Saw Cleaver primarily scales off the strength stat, not skill. And that right there is the main problem with the Saw Cleaver, is you can either choose to go with damage from the main weapon, or you can go with damage from parries, or you can do a mixture of both, but no matter what, you're not getting ideal damage. Now, with that being said, it is much faster than the Hunter Axe, and it is much better at dealing with these bigger, more difficult enemies than the Threaded Cane. So as I said before, it is the jack of all trades, master of none. But it's still a pretty good weapon, because even though you're not getting ideal damage with the parries, that's still one shot. So the parry damage is still good. The range is still good enough to get most of what you need. The speed, the range, the damage is a very versatile weapon. It's not the best at any one thing, but it's extremely versatile. And when going through the game, you're going to deal with a lot of different enemies that have a lot of different attacks. Some are big, some are small, and having that versatility will really help you out in the hunt, especially if you're only going with a single weapon. And if you're going to choose the Saw Cleaver, that's what you need to keep in mind, is that it's good enough for just about any situation, but it's never ideal for any single situation. But with that being said, we can move on to the Hunter Axe, which, looking at this, you can tell immediately it is a much slower, heftier weapon. It doesn't bring the speed that the Saw Cleaver does, but it brings a lot more damage. Often 1 to 2 shotting. And here, as you can see, it's not upgraded whatsoever, though I am running with the Violent Past Origin, which has the highest amount of points into the strength stat. Though, that doesn't make too much of a difference. And as you can see, there, still a 3-shot on that guy, but still more damage. It's going to be easier to hit breakpoints. Though, the real calling of this weapon is when you go into the transformed version. As you can see, it puts the gun on your back, no longer in your hands. And when you try to press the shoot your gun button, you'll end up doing these large, very wide sweeps that do basically a full 360 swing around your character. And that, combined with the high range, the best range of the 3 starting weapons, and this is actually the best starting weapon when it comes to crowd control. And because of that heightened damage and range, it allows you to take much more aggressive posturing in fights, especially against several enemies or a single big enemy. Now, the light combo here, as you can see, that first swing is a swipe, which is good for multiple enemies, but the rest of the combo, the middle of it, is basically just a straightforward point when it comes to the hitbox. So you're really going to want to go with these L2s when dealing with multiple enemies, and the light attack combo is more for one-on-one encounters. Though it does come with a problem, as you can see there, of fast, agile enemies like dogs. That just ends up missing a lot of the time. So that can be a problem, but for the most part, you'll more so be noticing the high damage and stun. So, coming up here, as you saw with the Saw Cleaver, there's an upgrade material. You don't need that as much for the Hunter Axe, since it already has higher damage, but upgrading it just makes you even more powerful. But the real power comes against these big enemies. The two-handed charged attack does massive damage and knocks the trolls down. Though, that does come at the cost of not being able to parry when you're two-handed, because you do that swing. And that's really where the Hunter Axe lies. It's much less about parrying and much more about having high damage, high range, and high stun. And so, if you're not a fan of parrying, if you're not a fan of Quicksilver bullets, if you're not a fan of using the guns, then this is a great option. Though, it does come at the cost of not being nearly as good against fast, agile enemies like dogs. That can be very annoying. I'm not having a problem with them here, because all of them are either locked up in cages or busy looking at other characters. But that's not how the entire game is going to be, so going with the Hunter Axe, just remember, the fast enemies are the scary ones, not the big enemies. The big enemies are very easy. Sometimes a little too easy. Because you can hit so hard that some of them just fall through the earth. Again, not upgraded whatsoever, but that's still 2-shot. So, keep that in mind. And a lot of early players have trouble with these enemies. And that's the more difficult variant. Still 2-shot. So, this is very much the powerhouse starting weapon. But you might be saying, oh, well, those were the charged attacks. What about the light attacks? Those don't hit as hard. But they still stun lock, and a single combo still kills them. Without any upgrades, I didn't level up this character whatsoever. So, as I said, if you want power and are willing to drop a bit of speed, then the Hunter Axe is the way to go. And this is the most simple, straightforward, kill the big enemy starting weapon. And it's quite popular for that. And it's by far the best for taking out these big, difficult enemies, at least early on. Now, moving on, the third and final starting weapon is the Threaded Cane. And coming off the Hunter Axe, you might notice, this is definitely a lot faster. More in line with the Saw Cleaver in terms of speed. And it also has a poke attack, which adds a bit of variety. When dealing with mobs of enemies, it's pretty good. You might find yourself on the defensive, and it may feel like the weapon is doing less damage than the others. And there's a reason for that. You see, it does do less damage than the others. But we'll get to that in a second. For now, it's a poke attack. And there are some enemies in this game that are very weak to poke attacks, but very resistant to other forms of attacks. There, as you can see, that enemy took 4 swings to kill, whereas the other weapons took 3. So, by raw damage numbers, this is the weakest. Though, as you can see here, moving to the transformed variant, it's kind of like the Hunter Axe in the sense that it's more about crowd control. Well, while the Hunter Axe was very much focused on range, this is more focused on spreading a wide net, being able to hit a wide area without going too far forward, while also maintaining speed. And so, it's not as good, at least in my opinion, for crowd control as the Hunter Axe, but it also doesn't come at the cost of that lowered speed. So, it doesn't reach as high of highs, but it doesn't reach as low of lows. It's a bit more generalized. Though with that being said, because it's not as powerful, you may find yourself on the back foot. Partially because it doesn't reach those high highs, partially because it doesn't have that damage. And yeah, it's pretty commonly believed that the Threaded Cane is the worst of the 3 starting weapons, and it definitely is in terms of raw damage. And in general, for the most part, I would agree, it is the worst starting weapon. Though, as you can probably tell by now, you can get upgraded materials in order to smooth out that damage a bit. Though, you can compensate for lower damage. It's a bit harder to compensate for dealing with these bigger enemies, where only every other heavy attack actually gives a stun. And even then, as you can see, it does way less damage. And I picked the best starting class for this weapon, so yeah, you're gonna have some trouble. The damage just isn't good. It's fast, but the damage isn't there. Though with that being said, there is one thing that it really excels at, especially when dealing with those larger enemies, and that's the scaling. You see, parrying scales off the skill stat, and while parrying is more difficult than just pressing R1 normally, if you can get it down, it is a very powerful tool. And, as I said, parrying skills off the skill stat and the threaded cane is the only one of the 3 starting weapons that has good scaling off of skill. So, it's not as good in terms of the weapon itself, but it's the best starting weapon if you can manage to learn parrying. And so, if you can deal with the weapon not being as good, and you go full on into parrying, this weapon can definitely end up holding its own because of that. And it can still do pretty well. Like I said, it is objectively the worst of the 3, but not entirely useless. Though, with that being said, we should go into which one I would recommend. And for new players, the first one I would recommend is the Hunter Axe. Because you don't need to learn parry timings, you don't need to learn a lot of the attack timings. You have range, you have power, you have stun. It's the simplest, it's the most straightforward, it requires the least amount of skill. It's very popular for that reason. The second one I would recommend is the Saw Cleaver. Like I said, while it's not as powerful as the Hunter Axe, and it's not as good for parrying as the threaded cane, it is the most versatile of the 3, generally speaking. And that can really go a long way, especially if you're only using a single weapon, which would mean needing less upgrade materials and needing to learn only a single weapon instead of 2 or 3. And a lot of people, because Bloodborne goes to that quality over quantity approach for weapons, a lot of people tend to get very attached to a single weapon. And so, because of that, I would have to go with the Saw Cleaver as the second recommendation. It'll require a bit more skill, it'll require a bit more observation and learning the enemies for dodging and parrying, but it's still a very good weapon. And the third one, the one I would recommend the least, is the threaded cane. As I said, it's not terrible, it's not useless, it can definitely hold its own, but it requires the most amount of skill, it requires the most amount of knowledge, and when you're first going into a game, you want to lower the skill and knowledge requirement as much as possible. So, while this can be the first starting weapon you go with, it's not the first starting weapon you want to go with, unless you really want to get into parrying. Because I mentioned before this idea of them all having their own doctrines and them kind of contributing to how your skill set grows and how skilled you become at the game. While the threaded cane would be the most difficult for a first run, because of that difficulty and because of the demand for you to learn how to parry, by the end of the run, while it would be the most difficult, it would end with you being the best out of those three. Though, with that being said, again, I mentioned doctrines and how they all have their own views and skill sets and playstyles. And I touched on that a little bit here, but I didn't go into a lot of detail because I didn't want this to be like a 45-minute video. So if you want me to touch on that a bit more, I can definitely do a video purely for that and delving deeper into that. But with that being said, yeah,